Well, as most of you know, I'm a very visual person, but I'm low tech. So I am going to do something a little unique. Although some of you, I see people in the room that have seen me explain the state budget with Kleenex boxes, but why am I doing that? In order to talk about sustainability and infrastructure and how to move into the future, we have to kind of, I believe, understand where is the state, where have we come from, and then we can know how do we move forward. Where are we deploying our resources now, and where are we in that those few sentences that the governor related to in the budget. Now, my family's had the blessing of being part of Arizona's heritage and history for, well, 5 generations, I guess, including my grandchildren, but 6. My great-great-grandfather had a mercantile store in Douglas, Arizona, right on the border in the late 1800s. The family actually lived in northern Mexico, but the store was in Douglas, so we had that international thing going a long time ago. My great-grandfather then decided he wanted to move north a little bit, arrived in Gilbert in 1915 and started a dairy farm. Another great-grandfather on my father's side was the first mayor of Glendale, had the livery stable in town, and had the one well that supplied everyone in Glendale with water. My grandparents ended up in the Prescott area where they started the oil company 75 years ago. My grandparents' phone number in Prescott was 49. So I think we have sustained a few generations in Arizona. But what I want to do is do a little presentation that explains very visually where does the state deploy its resources and where do they come from. Now, I'm going to move very quickly because it normally takes me a little bit longer than the 10 minutes allotted to do this. And I apologize to some of the folks that I see in the room, Jack Sellers and Glenn Williamson from Canada Arizona Business Council and a few others who have seen this. In fact, Sharon Pfeiffer was saying that her and her family caught this on the internet a few weeks or months or something ago. Where does the state deploy its resources, and where do those resources come from? The state resources come from sales and income taxes. It's called the general fund. When I started doing this presentation, the general fund was about $10.5 billion. Of that $10.5 billion, almost half of it goes to K-12 education. There's another almost $1.25 billion that goes to higher education, universities and community colleges. There's a little over $1 billion that goes to our prison and court system and some state law enforcement functions. These two together were about $2.5 billion. At the time I started doing this, higher ed was the larger of the two. That's actually changed. There's about $2.5 billion of these general fund resources that go to a variety of programs in health and welfare. Our indigent health care, access, Department of Health Services, Department of Economic Security, Child Protective Services, State Mental Hospital, Department of Developmentally Disabled. A variety of programs, about $2.5 billion, the largest of which is access. We have about 1 out of 5 Arizonans on the state healthcare program. Everything else of state government that comes out of the general fund adds up to $500 million or less. Everywhere from the legislature and the governor's office all the way down to all the little boards and commissions and all the other state agencies. Agriculture and banking and commerce and tourism, Department of Revenue that collects all the taxes, and land and water and real estate and veteran affairs, and on and on and on. But there's the general fund of the state of Arizona. A few years ago, $10.5 billion. It got a little bit bigger than that. It's back down a little bit. Right now, it's about $9 billion. Looks like that. In addition to the state general fund that we use, we also spend some other funds. There's about $1 billion that we collect from taxes on gasoline and diesel fuel, and the little license tags on our vehicles that goes to maintain the state highway and transportation system. There's about $1 billion of these other funds that ends up in the health and welfare system. This $1 billion comes primarily from taxes on alcohol and tobacco. Almost all ends up in the health and welfare system. There's about $500 million of these other funds that ends up in our higher education system. And there's hundreds of other little ones that fund a variety of programs in state government. Then, before we go to all of the federal money that comes into the state each year, it's important, especially in education, to illustrate that in addition to the state money that goes to the K-12 schools, they receive their share of the local property tax dollars that are collected at the local level. It does not go through the state's legislative spending process. But the schools receive a portion of the locally generated property tax dollars along with the money that they receive from the state. Community colleges are very similar. They're funded by property, or in part by property taxes collected from the local businesses and homes that are in their community college district, not the universities that become colleges. Then we get into all of the federal money. There's about $2 billion of federal money that ends up in the K-12 school system. Most of that money is associated with two groups of students, low income and special education. So these are your free and reduced lunch programs, anything based on an income level, and then your special education programs. There's about $2 billion of federal and other money that ends up in the higher education system. 2/3 of this $2 billion is federal dollars of whatever kind, grants, research projects, or anything that end up in universities and colleges. The other 1/3 is the tuition monies that the students pay as a portion of their expense. By far, I don't know, what are they? We've got two in higher education right there. By far the largest chunk of dollars that comes into the state from the federal government ends up in health and welfare. In addition to the about $3.5 billion of state money we spend on health and welfare, we receive each year about $6.5 billion of federal money. It's a taller table than I'm used to. In most states, this is called Medicaid. The federal government runs a Medicaid program. The state might run whatever they run, but in Arizona, we were the last state to join Medicaid. We kind of combine it together, and we run Medicaid and Access all together as one. It's on a matching deal, and we take, to get $2 of their money, you got to commit to spend $1 of our money, and we put it all together and run it through Access. Then there's some other stragglers. There's $500 million of miscellaneous. There's $500 million each of money that goes to the state lottery and the state compensation fund of Arizona, which is being privatized now. About $500 million a year of mostly EPA and federal money that comes in to do something related to cleaning up the environment. And about $500 million that goes to the state's Department of Administration. How are we on time? Okay. So this is what the state government looks like at any given time. $32 billion going somewhere. The big three, of course, being K-12 education at about $10 billion a year, health and welfare at about $10 billion a year, higher ed at about $4.5, and a variety of others that add up to $4 or $5 billion. I won't go through all the detail of how we made up for that, but I'll summarize it here in a second. In 2009, spending was initially increased to over $11 billion, even though the downturn was in full swing, and they were only projecting about $8 billion of revenue. Governor Brewer then said, well, we can't spend 11 if we're only collecting 8, we cut the spending. Actually, Napolitano's administration started to trim back a little bit of that. Brewer cut it back to about 10, but the economy worsened. It didn't come in at 8, it didn't drop from 9 to 8, it dropped from 9 to $7 billion in 1 year, the sales and income taxes coming into the general fund. $3 billion shortage 1 year. The governor mentioned that in her talk. They trimmed the spending to 9.5. Revenue continued to drop, 6.5. A second year in a row, $3 billion short. 11, they trimmed it to $9 billion in spending. That's when they went out to the voters to have the 1-cent sales tax added for a period of 3 years. That brought in an extra $1 billion. Fortunately, the economy didn't go any further down. That extra $1 billion coming in from the 1-cent sales tax added to the 6.5, brought the revenue to 7.5. So the deficit was narrowed to 1.5. In 2012, they cut the spending to 8.3. In large part because with the extra 1-cent sales tax in place, and the economy starting to grow a bit, they expected that 8.3 would come in from the revenue. The economy grew a little bit better than they thought. It came in at 8.6. which gave rise to about a 45-day argument at the Capitol of what to do with all the extra money. I'm serious, I'm dead serious. There were about 6 plans. One was all of the extra $300 million should go to increase the spending as soon as possible. Another said, let's put it back in the rainy day fund. Others said, let's pay back some of the delayed payments that we didn't send to the schools like we were supposed to on time, or swap money from a variety of state programs and agencies, or pay back some of the money that we borrowed. But we were at least balanced, but that was when we had the extra 1-cent sales tax in place. For the 4 years, though, we've been out of balance by about $9 billion. 1.5, 3, and 1.5 is about $9 billion. We made it through that 4-year period by using the $1 billion that we had in our rainy day fund. We delayed payments to all the school districts around the state for a little over $1 billion. We swept about $2 billion of money from all the variety of state agencies and programs that are supposed to use their dollars on whatever they're supposed to use it on, maintaining the roads or the chiropractic board or whatever it was. We borrowed about $2 billion, sold the state capitol, mortgaged a bunch of school buildings around the state. We're still renting the state capitol from a real estate investment group that bought the capitol and all the buildings around there. And we used about $3 billion of the federal stimulus money program. In 2013, with the extra 1-cent sales tax still in place for the last year, revenue increased to 9.1. Now I've heard that actually came in a little bit higher than that. So we had a little bit of a surplus. We collected more in 12 and 13, but that was the second and third year of that 1-cent sales tax. Now that that's gone away, our revenue has dipped back down below the spending level, so we're actually going to be in a bit of a deficit this year, but with that $1 billion surplus that kind of occurred during these 2 years, we should be able to get through that. So we're back into balance, but we had very little, if any, discussion at the legislature and the governor's office about how to address these issues. When are we going to start paying back some of the money that we borrowed? Included in this number of $8.8 billion that we're spending this year, I saw a release from the Treasurer's office, is about $380 million annually of debt service that was created by the borrowing that was done during these years. So almost $400 million of the money that we're spending this year is debt service from short-time things that we did over the last 4 years to get through the crisis. If we start to pay some of those things off, that will free that $400 million up to go in more productive areas. The long-term solution in my book is we've got to grow the economy. We've got to grow the pie much faster than it is right now. And yes, we are reported to be in some pretty good categories as far as where we look compared to some other states and our growth potential and things like that. Frankly, I think some of the potential turnaround is because of how far we fell the last few years. But we are poised to move forward, and this is where things are, and hopefully that provides you a context of where we've been, where we're at, and now let's go throughout the day and talk about how to move forward. Thank you.